Hello and welcome to another analysis behind the news, where we provide the perspective that you can use to help save American liberty and independence. We're doing something a little different today. Instead of looking back at recent news, we want to turn back to an incident that occurred just over 35 years ago, September 1st, 1983 to be more precise. That day is burned into the collective memories of veteran John Birch Society members, because that is the day when a sitting U.S. Congressman was brutally killed at the hands of our communist enemies. As we wrote in the September 14th, 1983 issue of our weekly publication back then, Review of the News, Larry McDonald, physician, congressman, chairman of the John Birch Society, Americanist patriot, was en route to a security conference in South Korea when the Korean Airlines 747 he was traveling on was shot down by a Soviet fighter over the Sea of Japan, killing all 269 passengers and crew aboard the civilian airliner. Though his death came 38 years after that of the man for whom the John Birch Society is named, the historical parallels between the life and death of Larry McDonald and John Birch are striking. Like John Birch, Larry McDonald was raised in Georgia. Like John Birch, a Baptist missionary in China who became a U.S. Army intelligence officer because his country needed his services, Larry McDonald left his medical practice to run for Congress because his country needed him. Like John Birch, who was brutally murdered by the communists while on a peaceful mission in the Far East, Larry McDonald was brutally murdered by the communists while on a peaceful mission to the Republic of Korea. Like the death of John Birch, the death of Larry McDonald was a typical communist-style execution in a typical communist-style war which observes no rules of international law, of civilization, or of human decency. The official version of the account blames the pilots of the civilian commercial airliner for not programming their autopilot correctly, which caused the plane to stray into Soviet airspace. Soviet fighter jets tracked the plane for 2.5 hours until deliberately targeting it and shooting it down with missiles. Now, before we close the history books on this one, let's ask the question, was there any reason that the Soviets would want Congressman MacDonald dead? We again turn to the September 14th, 1983 issue of the Review of the News. In it we've written, in Atlanta, Mrs. Catherine McDonald, wife of Congressman Larry McDonald, says that she urged President Reagan, when he called her today, to cease all trade with the Soviet Union and its satellites in retaliation for downing the Korean Airlines jumbo jet. Asked if she thought the communists had downed the plane because her husband was on board, Mrs. McDonald replies, I am not so naive to believe that the leading anti-communist in the American government who happened to be on the plane, that happened to be forced into Soviet territory, and happened to be shot down by missiles, was not planned. This is a typical action of communists and the Soviet Union. Further into the issue, it gives a profile on Congressman MacDonald that gives you an idea of why he was much more than just a thorn in the side of the Soviets. We've written, the principled representative from Georgia gave the communists and their allies plenty of nightmares as he sought to reactivate the House Internal Security Committee to deal with the growing espionage and terrorist threat to America. With very little information about the threat appearing in the media, Dr. MacDonald undertook his own anti-subversive crusade, building a case for congressional action by putting detailed, documented reports on terrorism, subversion, espionage, and intelligence matters into the congressional record on a continuing basis. He broadened this effort in 1979 by establishing the Western Goals Foundation to rebuild and strengthen the political, economic, and social structure of the United States and Western civilization, so as to make any merger with totalitarians impossible. The growing influence and reach of Western goals with its computerized data on subversion and terrorism, its weekly radio broadcasts, its books and monographs on the betrayal of America's allies and the Soviet manipulation of the nuclear freeze movement, its videotapes on terrorism and Soviet penetration of the U.S. government, and its conferences with anti-communist leaders in the Western Europe, gave the enemies of America more than sufficient reason for wanting to get rid of Larry McDonald. There are other anti-communists in the Congress, but none with the organizational skills, the network of contacts, the untiring commitment, and the clear vision possessed by Dr. McDonald. It's rather clear that the Soviets had much to gain from seeing Congressman Larry McDonald removed. But it wasn't just the Soviets, it was also the Cubans. In fact, threats against the life of Congressman, his staff, and his family were repeatedly made by terrorist and revolutionary groups associated with Cuba. Not to mention the numerous attacks to the court system from groups that had ties to the Soviets and Cuba. So it was the communist movement as a whole that would be better off without the good congressman and his efforts. At the time, John McManus, Public Relations Director for the John Birch Society, said, "The real story at this time is not the death of 269 innocent persons, however horrible each one of these deaths is. The real story is U.S. financing of communism, a practice that has continued for decades and has enabled communist leaders to engage in a long history of criminal activity. The American people must be made aware of this issue. If the passing of Dr. Larry McDonald helps to bring about this awareness, then he will not have died in vain." So as we contemplate each week on the machinations of the deep state, its enablers, and those globalists that advocate, plan, and build toward a new world order, we have to ask ourselves, seeing that communism is far from being dead, and that it has a direct hand in influencing the battle of globalism versus Americanism, are we motivated enough to get involved? When he was shot down, Congressman Larry McDonald was on his way to participate in meetings and ceremonies surrounding the 30th anniversary of the signing of the U.S.-Korea Defense Treaty. His prepared speech was never delivered, but the closing lines are telling. They read, "Governments obviously have a right and duty to their people to represent themselves in a truthful light to the leaders and people of allied countries. But it is also the duty of responsible anti-communist leaders in America to educate their fellow Americans. I can assure you that we are doing so. I can tell you that we are enjoying great success, and I can pledge to you that we will resist the communists who threaten us all, so long as God gives us breath." If this is the first time you are learning about Congressman McDonald, and you'd like to learn more, then we have a few in-depth articles that describe his efforts, his final hours, and the theory that the crippled plane landed, was subsequently confiscated, and that all on board were arrested and disappeared into the Soviet Gulag system. Links are in the video description. If you're so moved by Congressman McDonald's words, then please apply for membership in the John Birch Society and join our movement that has stepped forward so many times in the past, protecting American liberty and independence from those outside and within that want to see our great American experiment get swallowed up by globalist, collectivist, and communist forces. Again, links are in the video description. And please, like and share this video and subscribe to our social media channels and news alerts. Until next time, we'll see you then.